Good morning, Lee.
Good morning, Hannah.
Hi. Welcome back to our Nitpicks Facebook Live.
Hello, everybody.
Hi. We do these every Thursday morning. So if this is your first time, welcome. If you've been watching us every week, welcome anyway.
Hello.
Yeah. So we've been doing this little series every week, which is basically like a knitting 101. And the first week we talked about like the anatomy of ball bands. And then last week we talked about like yarn 101, so about the structure of it and fiber content. And this week, what are we talking about, Lee?
We're going to talk about needles, Needles 101. So hopefully everything you ever wanted to know and didn't even know that you wanted to know about needles. So please ask us questions if you want to know anything specific in the comments. And we have a bunch of needles here to talk about. Where should we start, Hannah?
I think we should talk about the different formats of needles, so the different shapes, maybe. Let's start there.
All right. So you have straight needles, first of all. Straight needles, which a lot of modern knitters never even use at all. And I still use sometimes. I do like my hue shift blanket, which is modular squares. I knit that on straight needles.
Really?
Sometimes, I think I actually was knitting that on circulars, which you can use circulars flat, which we'll get into later. But then I got 2 kittens last summer and they loved chewing on circular cords on the cables. So I wanted as few circular cables just like laying around sitting on the couch as possible. So I switched to straights and now I just use straights. With things that fit and don't have to like squish onto them, I find them easy to use. Yeah, but a lot of knitters just don't ever.
I think that they're the most iconic knitting needles. I think when you see a TV show or someone's knitting, that's generally what they're using, right? Or straight needles, because it's very identifiable. And I do think they do serve a really good purpose for things like scarves. So things that fit on them. You can buy straight knitting needles that are really long. So you could, I think the longest I've seen is maybe 18 inches, which is really long.
Yeah, and those bother me because those like get in the
You're
way
hitting.
and hit people if you're sitting next to someone. So I'll only use straights if they'll fit on short straights personally, but you can get long ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So things like scarves or dishcloths are a really good one for straight needles. Again, like hue shift, that one, I would never have occurred to me to do it that way, but you're totally right. And then cowls that you seam. So if it's a flat cowl or even like a hat that's knit flat, you could do on them as well.
Yeah, which I knit a lot of short rows flat hats that go around, and I will often use straights for those too because they're about the same height as a straight needle. Yeah. But speaking of knitting things flat, you can also use circular needles to knit flat, which if you're a new knitter, you might not realize that because it's called a circular needle. So you think of it as a round. I have a flat, this is a cardigan in progress. It's very long and flat, and it's on a long circular. So it fits on that cable. You know, it scrunches up, but you can kind of stretch it out and look at it. You know, that cable cord is connecting the 2 parts, and then you just go side to side and you just don't join it around, just knit flat. And you can do that with a small piece too.
Right. So circular needles, if you're not familiar with them, usually feature 2 tips. So that's like a hard surface. It could be metal, it could be wood, joined by a cable of some form. So there's, yes, exactly.
So this is a short one here, and you can also, they can also get very, very long too. See?
Right. And then
so these are both fixed circulars, so they're just the needle and the cable, and they're attached permanently like that.
And I find those most often in vintage needles as well. Like whenever I go to a garage sale, if they've got something that looks like this, they're usually fixed. A more modern variation on it are they're called interchangeable needles, where you can take the tips off, separate them from the cables. So that way you can mix and match different cable lengths and different tip sizes for a really flexible set of knitting needles.
A couple of different types of tips, a metal and a wood, and then Again, the cables can come in all different sizes. So here's a longer one and a shorter one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they have these screws on the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you want to attach them really quick.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a tip, and
Mm-hmm.
here's an end, and you just
Yeah, it just screws on.
it in. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then what you want to
And
do.
this is a step that a lot of people miss, and we've started printing it on our newer packaging. But if you've got an older set, it doesn't really specify. Do you have a cable key?
I do, yeah. So this is a set of interchangeables,
Mhm.
and it comes with cords and tips, and then it comes with a couple of extra little things. And one of them is a what are these called, Hannah?
They're called cable end caps.
Cable end caps. So if you want to put stitches on hold on a cable, you can unscrew the needle and screw in the end cap, and your stitches won't fall off. Which I've been knitting a cardigan with a bunch of different pieces lately, and I've been using those a lot. The other thing it comes with is a cable key, which looks like this. So there's these little holes on the cable end. You stick the key in the hole like that, and then you just twist tightly. So all you're doing is you screwed it on, and then you're just screwing it tighter by using that key to really get some leverage to really twist it really hard, harder than you'd be able to do with your fingers alone, so that it won't come unscrewed.
Right,
and
it also helps to loosen it a bit too. Yeah.
I'm going to say something that I think is important.
Yes.
Which I think a lot of people don't know. I recommend holding the metal part here with any wood needles, holding the metal part to screw it in, because if you hold the wood part and you do that every time, you're just slowly loosening that join over time. You're just kind of loosening it the tiniest little bit every time you do it, and after a couple of years, that might come detached out of the wood, and the metal might come apart. So to give your needles the longest length lifetime possible, just hold the metal in the metal and screw it that way. So you'll keep the needles nice.
Yeah. So the cable end caps, they attach to the cables when you're not using the needles, or if you want to take the needles and go somewhere else with them. Or I actually like to block some of my pieces while they're still on the cable. So if you put those end caps on, you can then safely submerge your project and get that wet if you wanted, or just put it into storage for later. You can also put a needle on one side and a cable end cap on the other, and then you've got basically two very flexible straight needles at that point.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a good way to add extra length. To your knitting if you want to spread it out more.
We've actually got a few questions. One is from Vivica, and she says, "Are there connectors to make my interchangeables really long?" And the answer is yes. Which I don't have one. I don't have one here.
I don't have one here either. Because Hannah, are those kind of new? Because I have a couple older sets, and they didn't. I don't believe. Maybe you had to buy them separately.
Yes, I don't believe that they come with a set, or if they do, that's a very new introduction. We're trying.
They do come with the
new ones,
the brand new ones, like the Prisms and the Cocobolos, maybe. But I don't have any of those sets.
Right. So those are things where you've got to buy them separately, but they're super inexpensive. And what that does is a little piece of metal that basically looks like the end, the butt of your needle, and you can screw a cable onto one side and on the other, so it just joins them together. It's a little piece of metal. And then again, tighten it using your cable key. I believe it has a hole, and then you've got an infinite number of, you can attach them forever. Exactly. So it'll look a little bit like that with a little joiner.
Like
yeah. So you could make it blanket width. You can make it basically as long as you'd like by just continually attaching cables. And you can also attach two short cables, or one short one and one very long one. I use it to get just like the most flexibility out of the set that I have.
And then speaking of like sets and lengths and stuff, so a normal set comes with like a size 24-inch and 32-inch cords, and so those are too long for like a hat in the round, for example, because when you're knitting around a circular, the actual circular circumference around the needles needs to be smaller than the circumference of what you're knitting in order for it to fit. And I have an example, a sweater. So you can see how it's kind of scrunched up. If the circumference of the knitting itself was longer than the cord, then you can use like magic loop with that, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But if you want to be able to just go around and around a smaller circumference, like a hat, then you need shorter circumference, which means shorter needles. Because if you had the long needles, you wouldn't be able to get that circumference.
Right.
So
And
shorter needles, shorter cords.
Adriana also asked if we have interchangeables in 16 inches, and there's your answer.
This is what
we
they
do.
Are, yes. Yeah, so these are our shorties, which are the needles themselves are just extra little bitsy, and then the cables make it 16-inch circumference around, so it's perfect for hats.
Hats and sleeves and baby sweaters. I use them for those as well.
Oh yeah, baby sweaters.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can, and these the connectors are all the same. So if you're wanting to mix and match because you need a size 8 and your regular length size 8 is already in use, then you can grab your size 8 shorty and screw it onto a longer cable too to make it longer. You're not stuck with it only being short.
Right. So all of our
the cool thing about interchangeables.
Yeah.
Mine are always mixed and matched with each other. And some, I mentioned the kittens earlier. They also like chewing on needle tips, so they've ruined a couple of tips. But then I can just mix and match, a purple tip with a green tip, and it's fine.
Right. Yeah, you can always buy replacement tips or extra sizes. We sell them in individual sizes and the sets. So it's a pretty flexible system. I actually really like occasionally using a metal tip and a wood tip, and we can get into this later with the substrates. We'll talk about that later. Actually, let's talk about DPNs really quickly and finish out our shapes.
Yeah, so that's the other way to knit in the round is DPNs, which are straight, but they're double pointed needles. So DPN, double pointed. So they have the tips on both ends. So there's no stopper to your knitting goes across all the way. So what you do is you kind of form a circle, a loop with your knitting, and you go around and around. So you would have, if your knitting is around 3 needles, you would be using 4 needles, and you would take the 4th one and knit from one onto the other, and then one onto the other. We have a video that shows you how to do this because it's hard to just explain in words.
Yeah.
I don't have a project on DPNs right now, but DPNs are really common, like for socks. I used to knit hats on DPNs before I learned about circulars. This was like 15 years ago. Yeah, you can knit anything in the round, but anything really large circumference is like not going to fit. So small circumference in the round. I think it's really common for like toys too, and it gets kind of fiddly with circulars. It's easier to manage on DPNs.
Right, or like mitten fingers is my go-to. So I'll do, I'll actually do magic loop it with a fixed circular for the body of the mitten, and then I'll do each finger with DPNs. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's.
Do we want to talk about magic loop because we kind of mentioned it, but we didn't talk about what it is?
Absolutely. Let's go that way first.
Yeah.
And again, if you've got questions, please chime in. And we'll talk about how we store our needles a little bit later. That's a question that's come up from Sherry. So for now, let's talk about magic loop.
Yeah, like I have some storage stuff I can show you.
Yeah.
Okay, so magic loop is a way to knit. Like I mentioned earlier, your circumference to just knit regular in the round of your knitting has to be bigger than the circumference of the needles. But if your circumference of the knitting is smaller than the circumference of the needles, then you use magic loop, which means you're basically just pulling a chunk of the cable out of the knitting. And we do have a video we'll show you. But so this, oh yeah, by the way, I was going to mention that our interchangeable needles only go down to size 4. So if you need to get a smaller than size 4 circular, you have to do a fixed, which is why I have these on a different brand of needle, because they're size 3. So that is one thing to keep in mind.
And the reason that we do that, and we get a lot of questions about why don't our interchangeable needles go smaller than that, and it's because of the way that they join to the cable. That screw actually winds up becoming bigger than the needles if you get too small. So you can't really have the hardware embedded in the needle tip if it's too thin. So that's why we convert at size 3, 2, 1, and 0 to a fixed circular. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a sock, and there's just a loop of cable right here, and then the 2 needles right here. And what you do is you basically knit across half straight and then across the other half straight. And we'll link to a video on this. But you just stick the needle into the stitches here and then pull this needle out to knit onto, so you have a loop there and a loop there, and you're just going straight across, back and forth. So you're going in the round with just extra cables sticking out there, which means you can knit as small, you can knit little fingers if you wanted to. So it might be fiddly. Yeah. It's a good way for socks and sleeves and all that fun stuff.
Right. And for all you pro sock knitters out there, you can do 2 socks at once on one very long fixed circular. And I know Lee's got a project, but I also, do you have it? If you don't have it,
right on my lap. Yeah. I'm currently knitting sleeves. This is sleeves. So you can do socks the same way. So it's a very long circular, which the longer the better for this kind of thing. And I'm like about to start this sleeve. So there's the one side in this sleeve. And what I'm going to do when I start knitting it is yank it out here so that this sleeve is on magic loop, but then the other side of the cable goes all the way around and is going around this sleeve. So I knit one row of this one and then one row of this one. And the great thing about this that I love for socks and sleeves, you're always knitting one row on the left and one row on the right forever. So when it's time to do an increase or decrease, you know where you are. You don't have to count on both of them separately. You just know that you do the increase on the one, then the increase on the other, and then they're going to be symmetrical in the same place the whole time. And of course, the best thing is that when they're done, they're done. You don't finish one, have that satisfaction of finishing, and then go, oh, now I have to knit the whole other one. You're just like actually done.
Right, and they're the same length. I always have this trouble making the sleeves the same length or socks, anything. So I just do them at the same time. That way they're identical, for better or worse.
Yeah, totally.
Do you want to talk? What were we going to talk about? Were you talking about storage next, maybe? Very briefly, if you've got some examples.
I have one needle binder here where I have kind of like one of every size, and I just for the purpose of this video I tried to make as many different types as possible, and we'll talk about the different types later, but they're like in order, and then there's a little pocket here for the cable, and then that's not nearly all of my needles, so I have this. I've been taking a bunch out right now, so it's kind of messy, but I have like this thing where I can just throw them all in. Yeah, for circulars, I find that this kind of like binder or folder kind of system is best to try to keep them all like in order, and then keep the cables and the tips like in the same place. You can also use like the original things that they came in, like that. Then for like DPNs and straights, I'll kind of stick them in cups and bowls around the house a lot of the time. And I have a couple different systems. Basically try to keep them all in the same place as much as possible, because when you have a bunch of different systems and you're looking for one size and you're having to dig through a bunch of different places, and whatever works for you personally. What works best for you, Hannah?
So I finally got rid of all of my straight needles, and I just grab them from work if I need them, but I generally use interchangeable needles for almost everything that I do. So I keep those in a little tin because it doesn't really matter to me if they get all mixed up. I don't mind hunting for them every time. But if you're more organized, using the needle binder or needle case is really handy. And I used to do that with before I started working here and had so many tips. Now I've got too many. I'd need like one of those old CD binders that would just be enormous. And the thing that I do organize, and unfortunately my computer's on top of it, is my cables. I do try and keep those separate from short, medium to long, just so I'm not having to dig through them, because they do get kind of tangled if you have enough of them. So I actually keep them curled up in a bamboo steamer, which is what my computer's on right now. But that's the way I found it works really well. I've seen a lot of really cool, basically a fabric strip with pockets where you can loop them through and they kind of hang on the back of a door. That seems like a really nice system.
Otherwise, I have one of those too for my fixed circulars. They're all on one of those things where I have like 3 tiers. So I have like the shortest and the longest in the middle, and all hanging. That's a good system.
Yeah. Let's talk about the different material types for needles while we're here.
Yeah.
You've got all your
So,
beautiful examples there.
so you have wood, which in the case of our needles is birch, right? And it can come in a lot of different colors.
So it's a laminated birch, which means that we're able
Laminated birch.
to color the different sections and then attach them and then trim them. So that's how we get that cool effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's Sunstruck, is that a rainbow, and then Majestic is the end there. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that's the laminated birch. Then there's hardwood, which is our new cocobolos.
They're beautiful.
Yeah, these I've really been enjoying knitting with.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a different feel from the birch. They're a little bit smoother and just like harder and a little bit pointier maybe. Yeah, anything else that like kind of sets those apart from each other?
It depends, not specifically these like hardwood versus laminated birch, because because the birch is laminated, it's very sturdy, so it feels like a hardwood to me. But I do have other wood needles that Knitpicks doesn't necessarily carry, but I have in my stash, and they're very bendy and flexible, a lot like bamboo needles, which is another substrate that a lot of people have. And so you're looking with wood, you will always have a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of warmth to it. Versus say a metal needle, which is like aluminum or nickel, or like carbon is another one that I see around. Those are generally inflexible. They can be lighter weight, and also the friction along the surface is different between wood and metal. So wood, you will be a little bit stickier, and I recommend that for cottons especially, or even, and then I would recommend metal for grabbier yarn. So even wool or lace, I prefer metal just because it's easier to slide in and move your stitches around versus wood. Yeah.
And I have a set of a different brand's bamboo here, so the bamboo looks a lot like wood, but it's just similar to wood. And metal, these are nickel. And then we also have we don't still have these, or do we?
No,
they're
not
old.
anymore.
These are Knitpicks,
The
but they're very
Zephyrs.
old.
Yeah, the acrylic,
like plastic. So that's another.
Yeah.
Vintage needles that you find at thrift stores might be plastic.
And that's like a cross between a wood and a metal. I feel like they're even more grabby than wood, and so they're really good beginner needles if you're really worried about your stitches falling off. So if you're working on that.
Yeah, totally. And then we also have the new aluminum Prism needles, which I don't have here, but the nickel and aluminum are both metal, but the nickel is smoother and slipperier. And the nickel, did I say that wrong? The nickel is smoother, and the aluminum is a little bit grabbier, and it's also
much lighter weight.
Lighter weight. And it warms up more.
Yeah, because I believe the body is hollow and it's thinner. So for me, the aluminum warms to my hand, but then the tips are solid on those because the way that they're constructed, the tip is solid. So they're weighted a little bit differently. And I really enjoy that. Whereas the nickel are much more balanced. So they're about the same density all the way down. But the aluminum, because they've got such sharp, solid points, they just have a different flow to them when you're knitting, and I really enjoy them.
Yeah, they're nice.
Yeah.
Also for allergies, some people have nickel allergies, so aluminum is a metal option that you can use.
Yeah. We have a few questions about Tony's asking, I've never knitted on a DPN in part because I struggle with how to do it, plus stopping for the night, like how do you set it down? And for me, the only time I've had trouble with the stitches staying on the needles whenever I walk away is if I've got too many on each needle or the needle's too short. If your needles are long enough, like I feel like you should have about 2 inches on either side when they're at rest and the stitches are expanded. That's usually my rule. I don't know. How do you do that, Lee? Do you? So either I scrunch on each side, I scrunch the knitting so that they're in the center, and then I set it down. Or we also have, they look like little earplugs, and they're they're needle
point protectors.
Point protectors, thank you. And you can put those on. We have them small enough for DPNs as well. There's also the Dpn Holder, which is like a cardboard tube that goes across them, and you can put your knitting on it and close the tube for the night. So there's a couple different devices you can use.
Yeah. I usually I think your tip is good to make sure you have enough room.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of, because I haven't knit with DPNs in a while, but if say these are DPNs,
Mm-hmm.
I'll kind of put them all so they're facing the same direction, and then kind of like wrap my
Yep.
project around them a little to just kind of keep things in place, and then put it in a project bag or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I also think that typically with DPNs, I try not to travel with them or keep shoving them in bags and taking them out. They tend to be my at-home projects more. So that way I'm not risking accidentally pulling a needle out or anything like that. But even if you do, it's easy enough to pick up your stitches typically, unless it's a super complicated pattern. So don't panic.
Yeah. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that unless you're knitting with like a silk or bamboo or something like really slippery, like any kind of wool or even like cotton, it's really not a huge deal for your needle to come out or to drop stitches. You can always look up tutorials for picking up rows below if you need, like if it actually dropped down and you have like a ladder down, like even that is pretty easy to deal with. And usually that's not going to happen. Usually you're just going to like have the stitches just like gonna drop a few on purpose. So
they'll just sit there.
They're usually just gonna sit there, and they might drop down like one row that's pretty easy to pick up, and then you just slip your needle back into them. And it's something that I think people are more scared of than they need to be, because it's really not that scary or devastating when that happens. Not saying that you should just let it happen on purpose, but it's something to like not have nightmares about. You know?
And I do think it's a skill worth practicing, picking up stitches. So if you have time and want to practice on like a gauge swatch, or just do a practice little square and drop your stitches and practice picking them up, we also have something called an emergency fix keychain, which I've used so many times. It's basically a double-sided crochet hook or a one-sided crochet that's very small, and it helps to hook those stitches and ladder them back up. Just way faster than trying to do it with a needle.
Yeah, for me, if it's like 1 or 2 rows down, I'll just use the needle. But if it's more than 1 or 2 rows down, it is much faster with a crochet hook. And you can just use a regular crochet hook for that. But the little fixers, sometimes they have keychains, so you just keep on your keys. You have them all the time, or put them in your project tool tin or whatever you have. Yeah.
And then we have two other very quick questions, and then we'll kind of wrap it up for today. One question is, how do you prevent that little gap in the magic loop, kind of where your stitches pull apart? And the same thing can happen with DPNs. And I think the tip here is just to give your yarn a little tug when you get to the second needle to close that gap. And also blocking will help in the end.
Yeah, so what we're talking about is like this spot on magic. So this is a unique thing where it's the 2 at a time, but because it's the 2 at a time, like this is always going to be in the same spot. I can't move it. Whereas with the other side, what I do personally is I try to pull it through different stitches each time. I look, and if there are any 2 stitches that look like they're a little further apart than the others, I make sure I don't pull it through that spot. I pull it through a different spot. So that way this side isn't going to have that possibility of that happening, but this side will. So I just pull it a little extra tight, really, is all I know to do. When I'm knitting that first stitch, I just pull that first stitch a little extra tightly.
Yeah. Perfect. And then I did mention, I see Terry is calling me out, that I did mention that sometimes I use a metal tip and a wood tip at the same time.
Oh yeah.
And I haven't come back to talk about it. And for me, there's another trick here. So either you can use 2 different kinds of material or 2 different size needles. So when you're knitting in the round, and this only works in the round, and you can do it back and forth, but it's different. I would only personally recommend it in the round. If you're working with a tricky yarn that either you have trouble keeping loose, or your gauge is a little bit off sometimes, or like with, for example, Fable Fur is a good one, where it's slippery and a kind of a novelty fiber. I will have let me think about how I would do it. The needle with more friction to it, so probably the wood one, would be the needle I'm knitting off of. That way it keeps the stitches on, and then the slicker needle, so the metal one, would be my working needle where I'm actually actively knitting with it. And to me, that helps like pull the fiber through and slip it off. And it just kind of keeps things anchored, but also encourages them to go to the next needle, if that makes sense. You can also, when you're knitting, use, because when you're forming a stitch, the needle that is actively knitting, so pulling the yarn through, that's what determines the size of your stitch height, so your gauge. You can go down a needle size or two on the inactive needle that you're pulling stitches off of. And that means that the stitches will come off a lot easier. So I do that with cottons because I have a hard time with cotton for some reason. So the needles are just, the stitches are all looser on that left, or for me, left-handed because I'm a right-handed knitter. So your non-dominant hand, those stitches will be looser on a smaller needle and easier to pull off because this needle in your dominant hand is the one that actually determines the size of the loop, and that's what your gauge is on. So there's a lot of kind of tricky ways of getting around your own knitting habits and also the yarn.
Sure.
Yeah. I think that was, oh, and then as we're signing off, Lee, can you actually show the end cap screwing on one of your circular needles? Just like an end cap attaching on. Someone had questions about, just wanted to see how it worked. And it screws on the same way as a needle tip. And then it creates that just hard stop. So your stitches can't slide off of it. And it's like I keep thinking of it as the, nope, I've lost that word. Like on a bookshelf, you've got the book.
Like a bookend.
Yes, bookend. I was thinking end caps for books. It's just been a morning already.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different reasons you might do this. One is if you needed this needle for another project and you didn't have another set and you wanted to just take off the tip. Or one is if the pattern says put these stitches on hold for later. Yeah, so I unscrew the needle, and this has a screw just like the needle has. Screw it on. And you don't need to use the tightener for this, just screw it on, and then your stitches can't fall off. And they're just stuck on there. Yeah.
So easy peasy, and it's a great way to store your project safely and put things on hold, especially if you're doing things like a top-down sweater and you want to put half of your stitches on hold. I'll put them on another cable and then just do the end caps on either side, and then they're safe, put away, don't have to worry about them. And they can just attach needles and go. Like anytime it tells me to put something on waste yarn, I don't do that anymore. I just use a spare cable and then put the end caps on.
Yeah, I have a cardigan right now where I'm doing the right side and then the back stitches are on hold for later that way.
Yeah. All right, so I think that's enough for today. We've got some links in the notes for everybody. Feel free to keep asking your questions in the comments and we will try to answer them. And then again, as always, tune in next Thursday. We're here every Thursday morning.
Maybe if anyone had a question that's a big question, we'll turn that into its own topic in a future week or something. So we don't want to see more topics.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Anna.
All right. And you can always, in the meantime, if you're looking for more content, you can join us on Instagram. You can join us on our blog. Our videos are on YouTube, and we have the Learning Center, which has so many tutorials and answers a lot of these questions that you had today. So feel free to kind of bounce around in the needle section of our Learning Center and, learn a new trick today, I guess.
Yeah. Happy knitting.
Happy knitting. All right. Thank you, Lee.